A school hallway, a trusted officer, and a 12-year-old girl. What should have been a normal day turned into something no one saw coming. When a corrupt cop targets the wrong child, he thinks he's just dealing with another quiet student. What he doesn't know, that girl's mother is the chief of police, and she's not about to let this go. What unfolds next is a gripping story of power, silence, and a mother's relentless fight for justice. And believe me, you'll want to stay until the end, because justice, when it comes, doesn't knock softly, it roars. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below, and if this story speaks to you, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now, let's get into it. The morning sun filtered gently through the gauzy kitchen curtains, casting long streaks of golden light across the tiled floor, as the smell of scrambled eggs and buttered toast mingled in the air. Chief Yvonne Brooks stood by the stove, one hand resting lightly on the handle of a skillet, the other holding a steaming mug of coffee, eyes still soft with sleep yet sharp beneath the surface. She wasn't in uniform yet, just a woman in a slate-gray robe, bare feet on cool ceramic hair, wrapped in a silk scarf, looking every bit the devoted mother rather than the city's highest-ranking law enforcement officer. Across the table, her daughter Amira sat hunched over her sketchpad eyebrows, furrowed tongue pressed lightly to her lip as she concentrated on capturing a curve just right. At 12, Amira had an artist's soul and the quiet boldness of a girl who understood far more than she let on. "You're going to be late," Yvonne said gently, setting a plate in front of her daughter, whose only response was a distracted hum and a nod that didn't look convincing. Yvonne sat down opposite her, tucking one leg under the other, then leaned forward slightly. "I mean it, baby. Eat first, draw later. The art's not going anywhere." Amira gave a reluctant smile, the kind that lingered only on one side of her face. "It's for the contest. Miss, Chen says they might frame the winner's drawing in the front office." There was pride in her voice, but underneath that shimmered something else: hesitation, the kind that children carry when they're unsure if the world will be kind to their dreams. Yvonne reached out, brushing a crumb from her daughter's cheek, her voice low and even. "You'll win if it's judged fairly, and if it's not, you'll still know what you're capable of. That matters more." The wind outside picked up slightly, making the leaves rattle against the kitchen window, like fingers tapping in thought, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Yvonne was thinking about the week ahead, the budget meeting with the mayor's office, the unresolved tensions in her department, and the subtle, unspoken weight of being a black woman leading a police force that didn't always want to be led. She'd grown used to silence that carried judgment and praise that was laced with skepticism. Even at the top, she often felt she was standing on the thinnest ice, forced to smile through rooms that only tolerated her because they couldn't deny her competence. "Can you come have lunch with me today?" Amira's voice cut through her thoughts, soft and hopeful, and Yvonne blinked, returning to the present. "I was going to stop by anyway," she said, masking her exhaustion with ease. "Maybe even bring those mini cinnamon rolls you like." The girl grinned, now full and real. "Yes, please. Can you bring extra for Zoe?" Yvonne chuckled, rising from the table. "You and Zoe and those cinnamon rolls," she teased, rinsing her cup. "She's not using you for snacks, is she?" Amira's laugh was quick and unfiltered. "Only a little," she said, tying the sketchpad closed with a careful knot, sliding it into her backpack like it held the map to her future. By 7:55 they were in the car, the radio playing something soft and forgettable in the background, the kind of station that Yvonne always left on when she wanted her mind to rest while driving. The city passed by in shades of steel and morning haze, sleepy storefronts and early joggers blending into the motion of a city slowly waking up. At the red light by the school, Yvonne's hand reached out instinctively, brushing Amira's shoulder, a silent moment of reassurance. "You know," she said, her voice dipping into something lower, almost private some days, "I feel like the world sees us through the wrong lens, like no matter what we do, it's filtered by someone else's story." Amira didn't answer right away. She looked out the window instead, watching a group of kids rush toward the school gates. "I just want to be good at what I do," she said. "Not good for a black girl, just good." Yvonne's throat tightened. She reached for her daughter's hand and squeezed it gently. "You are. Don't let anyone make you forget that." When they pulled into the drop-off lane, Amira unbuckled, quickly opening the door with the easy rhythm of routine, but she turned before stepping out. "Love you," she said. Yvonne smiled. "Love you more. And hey, remember who you are, okay?" The door closed and Amira blended into the wave of students flowing into the school, her backpack bouncing with each step, her shoulders square and steady. Yvonne watched until she disappeared from view, then exhaled deeply, her fingers tapping the steering wheel in a slow, restless pattern. She didn't drive away immediately. Instead, she sat for a moment in that small, still space between being a mother and being the chief, between cinnamon rolls and court orders, between the vulnerable and the invincible. The sun had risen higher now, and the light was harsher, casting clearer shadows. She put the car in gear, eyes narrowing as she glanced at the officer standing by the school entrance. Officer Chad Brenton, his expression unreadable, arms crossed too tightly, eyes already scanning the crowd. She didn't know it yet, but this would be the last normal morning she and Amira would share for a long time. And though nothing in the air said danger, something in Yvonne's chest stirred a quiet, persistent weight she couldn't quite name. As she pulled away the rearview mirror, held one last glimpse of the school bright in the morning light, unaware that before noon it would become the stage for something neither of them would ever forget. The hallway of Jefferson Middle School was already humming with the usual early morning rhythm. Lockers clanged open and shut, footsteps echoed against linoleum floors, and voices rose and fell in waves of adolescent chatter. The scent of pencil shavings, cleaning solution, and cafeteria muffins mingled faintly in the air, grounding everything in a kind of normalcy that made what happened next feel all the more jarring. Amira moved through that space like she always did, quiet but not invisible, present but not disruptive, a careful balance she had learned to master over the years, not because she wanted to disappear, but because attention was a coin too, easily flipped the wrong way. She walked with her sketchpad tucked tight to her chest, arms crossed over it like a shield, eyes scanning for her locker number among the sea of combinations and chipped paint. She was just a few steps from her locker when her shoulder grazed someone lightly, unintentionally, the kind of hallway contact that happened 100 times a day without notice. But this time, it wasn't just anyone. Officer Chad Brenton, posted outside the school office as part of the district's school resource program, turned with the suddenness of someone already on edge. He had been leaning against the wall, arms crossed and jaw tight, scanning the crowd like a man looking for a reason. When Amira bumped him, he straightened immediately, his stance stiffening, his gaze snapping to her face with an intensity that made her flinch. "Watch it," he barked, his voice sharp, not loud but cutting in a way that silenced the air around them. Amira stepped back instinctively, her fingers tightening on her sketchpad as she opened her mouth to apologize. "I'm sorry I didn't see you there," she said softly, her voice steady but small. He stared at her for a beat too long, eyes narrowing as if trying to place her not just as a student but as a problem. "What's that?" he asked, gesturing toward the notebook in her arms. "It's my sketchpad," she replied, holding it closer, confused by the question, unsure why her art should warrant suspicion. "Let me see it," he said, already reaching for it before she could respond. She took a step back, instinctively protective, her heart suddenly thudding with something she couldn't quite name, yet something heavier than embarrassment. "It's just drawings," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I'm working on a project for the art contest." But Brenton wasn't listening, or maybe he was and simply didn't care. Something had switched in him, like he'd decided that this moment, this girl, this morning was his to control. "Don't talk back," he snapped, stepping closer, his voice now loud enough to draw glances from nearby students. "I said, hand it over." Amira didn't move, frozen, not by defiance, but by the terrifying uncertainty of what might happen if she did or didn't. Her body went rigid, her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Around them, the hallway shifted subtly. Conversations dulled, movement slowed, and students began to edge away, sensing something they didn't want to be near but couldn't quite look away from. Then Brenton grabbed her arm. It wasn't a guiding touch or even a firm grip to redirect her. It was forceful, rough, uninvited, and completely out of proportion for the situation. His hand clamped around her upper arm, jerking her forward a step, and the sketchpad fell to the floor with a soft thud that somehow echoed louder than it should have. Against the lockers, he ordered, his tone now fully in command mode, the kind of voice meant to break resistance before it formed. Amira's breath caught in her throat as he pushed her toward the wall, her palms bracing against the cold metal. Her eyes were wide now, her lips trembling, and the shame flooded in before she could even process the fear. She felt it pour into her chest like cold water, being watched, being handled, being judged in an instant by someone who had already decided who she was. "I didn't do anything," she whispered, her voice cracking in the middle, not from disobedience but desperation. "I just dropped my book." But Brenton wasn't hearing her. His hand was still on her arm, his body angled aggressively toward her, and his mouth was set in a tight line of authority, the kind that didn't yield once it was made public. His eyes scanned her backpack like it held contraband, like a child's supplies could justify this level of scrutiny. "You don't get to decide what looks suspicious," he muttered more to himself than to her, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. It was a sentence laced with the kind of bias that doesn't need to be shouted to be understood. Amira closed her eyes. Her cheeks burned hot, not from guilt, but from the unbearable weight of being watched by her peers. Watched as she was treated like a threat, like something dangerous, when all she wanted was to turn in a drawing about friendship, flowers. She could hear the murmurs now, phones being raised silently, screens flickering on, as the incident became not just a humiliation, but a moment being captured, shared, made permanent. Somewhere behind her a teacher's voice called out weakly, "Officer Brenton, maybe we should wait." But it was the kind of resistance that sounded more like permission in disguise. Brenton turned toward the voice and waved it off with a dismissive shake of his head. "I'm handling it," he said flatly, not even bothering to hide the disdain curling at the edge of his words. Amira didn't resist. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She stood there pressed against the lockers, breathing in short, trembling bursts, wondering how the morning had slipped so quickly from routine into nightmare. Her hands were open, palms pressed flat against the cool surface, the same way her mother had taught her to do if she was ever pulled over. Slow movements, visible hands, no sudden gestures. She wasn't sure if that rule applied to hallways. Time blurred. The footsteps around her seemed distant, and the overhead lights flickered slightly, as if even the building couldn't decide whether to stay steady or flicker out. Her knees ached from the tension in her legs, but she didn't dare move. Somewhere down the hall, the first period bell rang clear and sharp, a tone that usually signaled beginnings. But for Amira, it only marked the moment she realized that safety, even at school, even in daylight, was not something she could ever take for granted again. And just like that, everything changed. Not with a shout or a scream, but with the quiet shock of a single question. Why me? The kind of question no 12-year-old should ever have to ask. The slap wasn't loud, but it cut through the hallway like glass cracking under pressure, sudden and sharp, silencing every whisper and freezing every motion around it. Amira staggered sideways from the force, her backpack slipping off one shoulder, her body thrown out of balance, not just by the blow itself, but by the stunning realization that it had actually happened. She didn't cry out, not yet. Instead, her hand flew instinctively to the side of her face, fingers grazing the stinging warmth spreading across her cheek like a delayed explosion. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came, only a gasp that caught in her throat, trembling with disbelief. The sketchpad she had clutched so tightly fell again to the floor, this time landing open pages, fluttering like wings, trying to lift away from the violence they had just witnessed. A cluster of students had gathered by then, drawn by the noise, frozen by the scene, unraveling before them. Wide eyes, half-covered mouths, the glint of phone cameras, raised slowly, uncertainly capturing every second in hesitant silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Not even the teachers near the end of the corridor. It was as if time had slammed into a wall and refused to keep going forward. Officer Brenton stood above her hand, still partially raised, the edge of his fingers trembling just slightly, either from adrenaline or regret, or perhaps from neither. His jaw was clenched, his eyes narrowed, as if searching for a justification that would make sense of what he had just done. But the truth sat naked in the hallway, heavy and undeniable, carried in the weight of the air that suddenly felt much too thick to breathe. Amira didn't look at him. She couldn't. She kept her eyes down, not from guilt, but because she didn't want to give him her tears. Not there, not with everyone watching. Her body felt numb, her breath coming in uneven shudders, the shock of pain slowly overtaken by the burn of humiliation. There was something uniquely brutal about being struck in front of your peers, not just hurt, but shamed, exposed, made into a symbol before you could even process what had happened. Somewhere deep inside her, a quiet voice whispered, "This isn't your fault," but it was drowned out by a louder, sharper echo. "They're all watching you now." The silence cracked when a voice rang out from down the hall, not loud, but firm, steady, unmistakable in its authority. "Hey!" The sound carried like thunder, slicing through the stillness, and all eyes turned toward its source. At the far end of the corridor, Yvonne Brooks stood perfectly still, her left hand wrapped around a folder, her right frozen mid-step, her eyes locked directly onto her daughter. Her breath had caught the moment she saw Amira pinned against the lockers, and now seeing her crumpled near the floor, cheek red and knees, shaking, something ancient and visceral began to rise in her chest. She walked forward slowly, deliberately, her heels clicking sharply against the tiles, each step a declaration of presence, each breath a battle to keep her rage from spilling out too soon. Her face was unreadable calm, in a way that only those familiar with deep practiced restraint could recognize, an expression that said, "I see everything, and I will not be rushed." Officer Brenton turned his head slightly frowning, still not grasping who she was, or perhaps simply not expecting to be challenged. "Ma'am, you need to stay back," he said, one hand raised in a dismissive gesture, his tone patronizing as though she were an uninformed onlooker interrupting a perfectly justified moment. Yvonne's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Let go of her," she said, each word wrapped in a calm so cold it burned. Brenton blinked, confusion flickering across his face as he hesitated. "She was being uncooperative," he replied, his voice wobbling just slightly, now unsure if he had misread something. "She refused to comply with my request." He looked at the students behind him for support, but they offered none, only silence, and the glow of recording screens pointed directly at him. Yvonne stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You laid hands on a child, in front of witnesses, with no provocation." Her tone didn't accuse. It stated. Brenton opened his mouth again, but nothing coherent came out, just the ghost of justification already crumbling before it could be shaped into words. "Who even are you?" he muttered, more to himself than to her frustration and defensiveness creeping into his expression. She stopped just a few feet from him now, her gaze steady, unblinking, and utterly unyielding. Then she said it clear and low, "I'm Chief Yvonne Brooks. That's my daughter." A visible ripple passed through the watching crowd, a breath drawn in unison, as the revelation landed like a stone in still water, reverberating outward with immediate force. Brenton's body stiffened, the blood draining from his face, as the words settled into place, irrefutable and irreversible. His hand dropped from his belt. His stance faltered. For the first time he looked down at Amira, not with contempt but with dawning fear. Amira didn't look up. She stayed exactly where she was, her fingers pressed flat against the cold floor, her breathing still shaky, but her shoulders beginning to square just slightly, as if the weight she had been carrying was shifting, no longer hers alone. Yvonne knelt beside her gently, not touching her yet, only speaking in a quiet voice that was meant only for her. "You're okay now. I'm here." And in that moment, despite everything that had happened, those words wrapped around Amira like armor, steadying her in a way that nothing else could. Behind them, the hallway remained suspended in uneasy silence, broken only by the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional shuffle of feet as students slowly began to back away, unsure of what to do, but certain they had seen something that would not be forgotten. Brenton took a small step back, but it was too late for retreat. The scene had been witnessed, documented, seared into memory. Yvonne stood slowly, keeping her body between him and her daughter, her presence now unmistakably, commanding her silence louder than any accusation. She looked him in the eye once more, this time, not as a mother but as a leader, and what he saw there made him lower his gaze. Not shame, not regret, just fear. And for the first time since the incident began, the hallway felt like it belonged to Amira again. Not because justice had been served, not because the pain had passed, but because her mother had stood between her and the world and said without raising her voice, "This ends here." For a moment, there was only the sound of breathing, shallow, sharp, uneven, and the quiet buzz of a hallway caught mid-collapse, the way a room holds still after someone knocks over something sacred. Yvonne Brooks stood between her daughter and the man who had just assaulted her, her frame steady, her voice still echoing faintly in the air. "That's my daughter." But what lingered wasn't the sentence, it was the weight behind it, the quiet storm carried in the bones of a woman who had spent a lifetime mastering silence in rooms that weren't made for her. Officer Chad Brenton stood frozen just a few steps away, face pale, fingers twitching at his sides, as though his own body had yet to decide whether it should run, apologize, or double down. And around them, the crowd of students stood transfixed, their phones hanging at their sides. Forgotten now, because whatever this was, it had crossed a line that couldn't be undone by footage or deleted by fear. Amira was sitting on the floor now, not because she was injured, but because her legs had quietly given out beneath the weight of everything that had just unfolded. She held her sketchbook in her lap pages slightly, bent her hands trembling as they tried to straighten it, as if fixing the paper could somehow fix the moment. Yvonne crouched beside her, not speaking, not touching, just close enough for Amira to feel the warmth of her presence and the calm certainty that her mother, who in that moment was not a chief or a badge but just a woman who loved her child, would not let her stand up alone. Brenton shifted his weight, cleared his throat, and tried to reassert control, though his voice had lost its edge. She was resisting. I asked her politely to hand over her notebook, and she got defensive. His words stumbled out, unsure of their own shape, eyes darting toward the bystanders as if fishing for allies in a sea that had already turned away from him. Yvonne didn't stand yet. She just looked up at him with a gaze so level it felt like a mirror being held up to something he didn't want to see. And you thought that justified physical force on a 12-year-old child. In a school hallway, her voice remained low, measured a controlled current just beneath the surface, but it carried something far more dangerous than anger: truth. He flinched, whether from her words or from the knowledge that each one was being heard by dozens of witnesses she couldn't tell. You don't understand. He tried again, defensive now, hands moving in small, frustrated circles. You weren't here. You didn't see the way she looked at me. The attitude, the silence, the way she... He stopped, suddenly aware that every word he said made the hole beneath him wider, not shallower. Yvonne rose slowly, dusting off her knees with a grace that felt more commanding than any raised voice could have been. You're right, she said, not taking her eyes off him. I wasn't here. She paused for just a breath. But now I am. And I saw exactly what I needed to see. There was no drama in her tone, no threat in her words, but the shift in the hallway was immediate. Something had passed from her to the crowd, a recognition that things had changed, and this would not be buried, not ignored, not passed off as a misunderstanding between authority and a disruptive student. Brenton stepped back ever so slightly, as if the act of retreating could put distance between him and his decision. But Yvonne was already turning toward Amira again, her attention returning to the only thing that mattered in that moment. She knelt beside her daughter and reached out slowly, so Amira could choose whether to lean in or stay still. The girl didn't hesitate. She moved into her mother's arms with a kind of quiet collapse, her body folding forward in a way that said more than any words ever could. Yvonne held her without speaking, without explaining, just letting the weight of her own strength be something Amira could borrow for a while. Behind them, the hallway began to breathe again, students slowly dispersing, teachers guiding them away, the school counselor arriving too late and too uncertain, clutching a clipboard like it could serve as a shield. But none of them came near Yvonne. Not yet, not until she was ready. She didn't rush. She waited until Amira's breath had steadied, until the trembling in her arms had eased just enough for her to pull back and meet her mother's gaze. I didn't do anything wrong, Amira said quietly, her voice so thin it nearly broke. Yvonne's hand brushed a curl from her daughter's cheek, her voice calm and certain. I know, baby. And you won't have to prove that to anyone. Not anymore. When Yvonne finally stood again, she did so with Amira at her side, one hand still gently on the girl's shoulder, steadying her as they prepared to walk past the man who had made a child feel like a threat. She didn't look at Brenton again because there was no power left in him, not in his posture, not in his badge, not in the justification unraveling behind his eyes. Instead, she looked forward, guiding her daughter down a hallway that now felt like both a battlefield and a courtroom, every step echoing like a closing gavel. Outside the building, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the sharp scent of rain that hadn't yet arrived but was coming soon. Yvonne paused just before they reached the doors, taking one long breath, then another, grounding herself in the moment in the feel of Amira's small hand wrapped in hers. Let's go home, she said gently, and Amira nodded, the simple movement, saying more than any conversation could hold. And as the door swung open to let them out, the sunlight struck Yvonne's face, not harshly, but cleanly, like a spotlight, illuminating something that had always been there, but was only now being seen. She stepped into it with quiet resolve, not because she had won anything, but because she knew the fight had only just begun. But in that moment, with her daughter beside her and the truth no longer hidden, she felt a stillness rise inside her, a promise, a presence, a line drawn, not in anger but in love. The moment the words left her mouth, "That's my daughter, and I'm Chief Yvonne Brooks," the hallway didn't erupt the way dramatic stories often describe. It tightened like a drawstring pulled suddenly around the breath of everyone present. It was the kind of stillness that didn't come from silence alone, but from realization, from the collective shock of witnesses, watching the ground shift beneath their feet. Officer Chad Brenton's face transformed in slow, visible stages. First confusion, then disbelief, then something close to dread, like a man waking to discover that the house he thought he was building his future in had no foundation at all. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He took one small step back, as if distance could dilute what had just occurred, as if moving could somehow unwind the thread he had just pulled loose. Around him, the eyes of students no longer looked down or away. They stared fully engaged now, their expressions a mix of vindication, fear, and awe. Some still held their phones up, recording without blinking, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would outlive the hallway. Others lowered their screens, not out of disinterest, but because they realized they didn't need video to remember this. This would live in them, in their conversations, in their quiet moments of self-reflection, long after the footage faded. Brenton swallowed, blinked twice, and said, You're the chief," but the words were too late, too brittle to matter. Yvonne didn't answer. She didn't need to. The badge wasn't on her chest, but the authority was in her spine, her stillness, her silence. She looked at him the way a courtroom looks at a defendant who's just realized the jury has made up its mind. It wasn't personal yet, it was deeply personal. It wasn't loud yet, it filled the entire space. He took another step back, this one more uneven, and murmured, "I didn't know." The words felt desperate, like an excuse looking for an exit, and they hung in the air with no place to go. Yvonne's voice, when it came, was soft and deliberate, the way one speaks to a person already exposed. "No," she said. "You didn't. And that's the problem." The weight of those 7 words was almost physical. You could feel it press against the walls, seep into the lockers, sink into the floor. It wasn't just about her daughter anymore, it was about how many other children he hadn't known, how many names he never bothered to learn, how many stories he'd cut off at the surface because he thought the cover told him everything he needed to know. Amira stood quietly beside her mother, now no longer trembling, but holding herself with the kind of delicate poise that only comes from being both seen and protected. Her fingers wrapped around the frayed edge of her sketchbook, smudges of graphite on her fingertips, eyes locked not on Brenton but on the spot just beyond him, as if looking directly at him would give him something he didn't deserve. One of the students in the back whispered, "Oh my God," and it wasn't said with ridicule or laughter, but reverence, like watching something sacred crack open. The principal finally arrived, breathless and bewildered, half running down the hall with a radio clipped awkwardly to his belt and a clipboard clutched like a lifeline. "Chief Brooks," he said between gasps, voice high and panicked. I didn't know you were on campus today." His eyes darted from Yvonne to Brenton to the gathered crowd, then back to Yvonne again, as if trying to determine what version of the story to prepare for. "Is everything all right?" he asked, but it was too late for that question. It had been too late the moment Brenton raised his hand. Yvonne turned her head slightly, not in anger, but in disbelief, as if she were staring at a man who still didn't realize the water was rising. "You have officers here who think hitting a child is procedure," she said, her voice calm but hollow. "What do you think is all right about that?" The principal began, but then stopped, realizing there was no answer that wouldn't reveal something about himself. Brenton's shoulders slumped slightly, the bravado now leaking out of him like air from a balloon. He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes flicking downward, and then toward the wall, as if some inanimate object might give him a script to follow. The hallway was still full, but no one interrupted. No one spoke. The students, the staff, even the security guard who had arrived too late to do anything. Everyone just watched. Some because they wanted justice. Some because they wanted to see what justice looked like. But a few, the ones with eyes wide open and hands clenched tight around their books, were watching for something more. They were watching to see if the system they had been taught to believe in could bend just this once toward something resembling dignity. Yvonne took one long breath and reached for Amira's hand. "We're leaving now," she said, not to anyone in particular, but with enough clarity that no one mistook it for a suggestion. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for a nod. She simply turned and began walking her daughter beside her, their steps in sync, their shoulders aligned like matching lines on the same blueprint. Brenton didn't stop them. The principal didn't follow, and the hallway slowly, cautiously began to part for them. As they walked, Amira whispered, "Are we in trouble?" Her voice was thin, uncertain, a child's question shaped by fear and confusion. Yvonne didn't stop. She just squeezed her daughter's hand a little tighter. "No, sweetheart," she said. "We're the reason someone else finally is." By the time they reached the main doors, the morning sun had risen just enough to pour across the school's brick entrance, casting long shadows behind them as they stepped out into the light. The glass reflected their silhouettes, tall and small, strong and steady, framed by the kind of brightness that makes everything behind you look dimmer. For a moment, Yvonne paused and glanced back, not out of regret, but to mark the place where everything had changed. The hallway, the silence, the badge, the blow, none of it could be erased. But as the wind lifted the edge of her coat and the sunlight brushed her cheek, there was clarity in her posture, resolve in the line of her jaw, and something fierce and unshakable in the way she whispered to herself, "No one ever puts hands on my daughter again." And then she walked forward, not because the fight was over, but because the world finally knew exactly who she was. The air inside the principal's office was thick, with a kind of silence that didn't settle. It clung like humidity before a storm, wrapping itself around shoulders and tightening throats. The blinds had been drawn halfway, leaving slices of afternoon light cutting across the desk, catching dust in its path and throwing it into slow motion. Principal Hastings sat behind the desk with his back uncomfortably straight, his tie pulled a little too tight at the collar, as if even his clothing didn't know how to behave under the weight of what had happened. He kept adjusting the pens in a little ceramic cup on his desk over and over, not because they needed organizing, but because his hands needed something to do while he avoided looking up. Across from him sat Yvonne Brooks, her posture unshaken, her expression unreadable, though the stillness in her shoulders was beginning to vibrate beneath the surface. Amira sat beside her, smaller in the leather chair than usual, knees drawn together, arms crossed over her middle, not in defiance but in quiet protection. She hadn't spoken since they'd walked into the building, and even now, as the clock ticked softly on the wall behind the principal, she remained completely still, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Chief Brooks Hastings finally began, his voice hesitant, trying to sound measured, but slipping into the brittle territory of damage control. "Let me start by saying that what happened today does not reflect the values of our school community." Yvonne didn't respond. She just looked at him calmly, as if waiting to see whether his words would evolve into something worth answering. He cleared his throat and continued, "We've already placed Officer Brenton on temporary leave, pending an internal review, and we've begun gathering witness statements from staff and students." She allowed the sentence to hang for a moment, let the word temporary settle in the space between them like a challenge, and then she leaned forward slowly, not to intimidate, but to be heard. "You placed him on leave," she repeated, her voice low and steady, "after he assaulted a child, in front of dozens of witnesses." Her eyes didn't waver, her tone didn't rise, but each word carried a weight that made Hastings visibly shrink in his seat. "If that child weren't mine, if I weren't who I am, what would you have done then?" The principal hesitated. "There are procedures," he began, but Yvonne cut him off, not with volume but with finality. "Don't hide behind policies. Tell me as a man, not as a job title, what would you have done if she were your daughter?" For a long second, the only sound in the room was the whirring of a ceiling fan spinning too slow to offer relief. Hastings looked down at his desk, fingers tapping faintly against the wood, and said, almost in a whisper, "I don't know. It wasn't a lie." That was the part that stung the most. Yvonne exhaled through her nose, a slow release of pressure that didn't bring peace, only clarity. "I do know," she said. "I know what I'm going to do, and it won't stop with a leave of absence." She reached over and gently rested a hand on Amira's shoulder, not for reassurance, but for grounding, as if this whole conversation, this whole process, wasn't just about justice, it was about returning something to her daughter that had been taken in a single public moment, the right to feel safe. Sarah James, the district's legal counsel, entered the room without knocking her heels, clicking sharply on the tiled floor, folder in hand. Eyes already scanning the space like she was walking into a fire she'd been briefed about, but hadn't expected to still be burning. "Chief Brooks," she nodded, setting the folder down on the table between them. "I've reviewed the initial reports. I want to assure you that we're treating this matter with the seriousness it deserves." Yvonne raised an eyebrow but didn't speak, and Sarah seemed to sense that trust wasn't something to be requested, it had to be earned. "There will be a full review of Officer Brenton's conduct. Depending on the findings, disciplinary action up to and including termination could be taken." The words were precise, professional, and just vague enough to leave room for retreat if needed. "Could be isn't good enough," Ivan replied quietly. "He struck a child. My child. In an educational setting. That's not a review. That's removal. Immediate and permanent." Sarah blinked, her face unreadable, and then offered a slow nod. "I understand. But there are steps that—" "Yes," Ivan interrupted, "and I've walked every one of them for 22 years. Don't lecture me on process. This isn't about policy. This is about whether or not this school, this district, believes black children deserve to be safe." The words landed like thunder in a sealed room. Even Hastings looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. Amira shifted slightly in her chair, not because of the tension, but because she was watching her mother speak, not as a chief or a figure of authority, but as the woman who kissed her forehead each night and told her she could do anything. For the first time since the incident, Amira's fingers relaxed just slightly around the edges of her notebook and her shoulders straightened an inch. "I'm not just here as the chief," Yvonne continued, her voice softer now, not less firm, just less sharp. "I'm here as a parent. As a mother trying to explain to her 12-year-old daughter why she was treated like a criminal for going to school with a sketch pad." No one responded. There was nothing to say that wouldn't feel empty. Outside, the sound of students switching classes echoed faintly through the walls, shoes against tile locker doors, slamming voices rising and falling in bursts of normalcy that felt impossibly distant from the room they were sitting in. Yvonne glanced at the clock, then at Amira, who looked up at her with a calmness that hadn't been there earlier. "We're done here," Yvonne said quietly, standing and gathering her daughter's bag. "You'll receive a statement from my office by morning." Hastings stood too quickly, almost knocking over his chair. "Chief Brooks, please understand this wasn't how we wanted today to go." Yvonne paused in the doorway, her hand resting on Amira's shoulder. "I'm sure it wasn't," she said, without turning around. "But that's the difference between you and me. I don't care how it looks. I care what it was." And with that, they stepped into the hallway, the door shutting behind them with a soft click. Not a slam, not a crash, just a sound that said enough. And as they walked away side by side, their steps steady and aligned, the hallway didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt clear, as if every eye watching now understood who had been wrong and who had stood up to make it right. The precinct didn't feel the same anymore. Not in its rhythm, not in its temperature, not in the way voices traveled between walls that had once felt neutral, but now seemed to lean in and listen. Yvonne could feel it the moment she stepped through the glass doors, the quiet shifts in posture, the sidelong glances that lingered a beat too long the way. Small conversations stopped when she walked past, then started again with a lower tone. It wasn't that they had stopped respecting her position, they hadn't, but respect was no longer the same as solidarity, and beneath the clipped nods and formal greetings, she could hear it in the silence, doubt. In the main hallway, the morning light spilled through the front windows and scattered across the linoleum in soft angles, as if even the sun wasn't sure how bright it should be here. She walked with measured pace, heels firm against the floor, back straight, chin slightly lifted, not in arrogance, but in the kind of quiet defiance that comes from knowing the air around you has shifted and choosing to breathe it anyway. As she turned into the roll call room, she caught a glimpse of Officers Daniels and Mercer speaking in hushed tones near the bulletin board, their voices dropping immediately when they saw her, followed by the same forced smiles that always came a fraction too late to be genuine. She didn't stop. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. The meeting room felt colder than usual, not in temperature but in reception. Officers filled the chairs, their postures stiff, their faces unreadable, the camaraderie that once hummed under the surface now replaced with something tighter, more fragile. Some avoided her gaze entirely, while others looked directly at her, not with malice but with the kind of caution that comes from wondering if what they once admired now threatened them. She took her place at the front of the room, flipping open her notes, then paused, not for effect, but because she wanted the silence to belong to her, not to their discomfort. "I know some of you think what happened last week was personal," she said, evenly scanning the room. "And you're right, it was. My daughter was assaulted in a school hallway by someone who wore the same badge you do." A shift in energy moved across the room, not as sharp as anger, but not quiet either, more like the murmur of men trying to decide whether to listen or retreat behind defensiveness. She let the pause stretch again, not to provoke, but to give them room to feel what they needed to feel. "But this isn't just about her," she continued, voice steady but resolute. It's about what kind of department we are. What kind of people we are when no one's watching, when the cameras are off, when the child in question isn't the chief's daughter. She saw Daniel's glance toward Mercer, his jaw-tight arms folded across his chest. She knew that it was the face of someone balancing between fear of change and fear of exposure. And she didn't blame him, not yet. "I won't pretend this is easy," she said, lowering her gaze to the table for a moment, then lifting it again, softer now. "We've all seen how fast the tide turns. One moment you're trusted, the next you're on trial, not because you've changed, but because the truth caught up faster than you did." Someone cleared their throat near the back. A chair creaked. The room didn't speak, but it shifted like a field of tall grass before a storm. Outside the glass wall, she could see two junior officers chatting near the copy machine, their heads bent close together, glancing toward the room like they knew they didn't belong in the meeting yet, couldn't look away from it either. She remembered being them once, eager, unsure, wanting to belong to something bigger, but not knowing what that something should be. Later that day, as she moved through the lower hallway toward her office, she overheard them again, this time not whispering but speaking just loud enough for her to catch fragments of the conversation. "She's making us look soft," one said, voice tinged with something between fear and resentment. "This isn't how we handle things." Another voice replied, lower-edged with frustration. "If it was any other kid, this wouldn't even be a conversation." Yvonne stopped walking just outside their line of sight, her body still, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to feel the weight of what she already knew. It wasn't just Officer Brenton she had to deal with. It was the slow leak in the foundation, the rot that grows not from a single act of injustice, but from the culture that allows it to multiply in silence. She turned the corner and stepped into their view, not with confrontation but with presence. The two officers froze instantly, one trying to pretend he was inspecting a bulletin board, the other looking down at his phone like it had just buzzed, though no sound had come. "Is there something you'd like to say to me directly?" she asked calmly, her voice like a quiet question written in permanent ink. They shook their heads stiff and robotic, and she nodded once as if confirming their answer wasn't the one they believed it to be. "Then I suggest you choose your words more carefully, because some of us are listening." That evening, as she sat in her office, with the lights dimmed and her back turned to the door, she watched the city lights flicker across the windows, each one like a quiet pulse echoing back at her. The silence in the precinct had followed her here, not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything left unsaid. She took a slow sip of cold coffee, her hand steady, her mind tired but unwavering. She knew she was pushing against something larger than one officer, larger than one case, larger even than one department. She was pushing against history, against habits, against comfort, built on the backs of those who never got to speak for themselves. And still, even in the exhaustion, she didn't feel regret. Outside, her office voices passed in the hallway, muffled but familiar, and for just a moment she allowed herself to lean back in her chair and let her eyes close, not in surrender, but in clarity. Because sometimes, leadership isn't about convincing people to follow, it's about standing so still in the truth that it becomes impossible to look away. It started with a file, just a manila folder, ordinary and unassuming, passed across a desk with a quiet thud that didn't match the weight of what was inside. Yvonne accepted it without speaking fingers, brushing the tab as she opened it slowly, not from hesitation, but from a kind of instinctive respect for whatever it held. Sarah James sat across from her, composed as always, though the tightness at the corners of her mouth betrayed the discomfort she was trying to conceal. "These are the prior complaints," she said, her voice low, her eyes not quite meeting Yvonne's. Some were formally closed, others quietly dismissed. None resulted in disciplinary action. Yvonne's eyes moved over the pages, and with each line she read a different kind of silence filled the room, one that wasn't heavy with shock, but sharpened by confirmation. Excessive force during a routine stop, verbal harassment documented by 2 separate witnesses, use of intimidation tactics against minors, racial profiling flagged repeatedly but never formally investigated. It was all there, an unbroken trail of harm, carefully buried beneath procedural technicalities and administrative indifference. Each complaint carried the same name, Officer Chad Brenton. She closed the folder gently, fingertips resting on the cover, not because she didn't believe it, but because she already had. This wasn't news, it was proof. And proof was its own kind of justice, but also its own kind of grief. "How long have these been on record?" she asked quietly. Sarah shifted in her seat. "Some go back 6 years. Most never made it past internal screening." They were labeled inconclusive or the witnesses declined to testify, and no one said anything. Yvonne asked, not accusingly but as if the air itself might answer. Sarah didn't respond at first. Then she sighed, her voice slower now. People talked, but nobody listened. Or they listened just long enough to make sure they didn't have to act. Outside the window, the wind was picking up, tossing the late afternoon light against the blinds in streaks of amber and gray. The city looked distant through the glass, like it belonged to someone else, another version of reality where things like this didn't keep happening in rooms that were supposed to be safe. Yvonne stood and walked toward the window, folding her arms as she looked out, the file still pressed under one hand. "This wasn't about my daughter," she said after a moment. "She just happened to be the one who didn't flinch when it happened in front of a camera. This is bigger than her. This is systemic." She could feel Sarah watching her the way people do when they're trying to measure whether you're about to break or ignite. "And now that it's out," Sarah said carefully, "you know it won't stop with Brenton. People will ask why no one caught this sooner. Why he was allowed to stay on the force this long." Yvonne turned from the window, her face calm but her eyes burning. "Let them ask," she said, "because I have the same questions, and I'm not afraid of the answers anymore." That night, long after the precinct emptied and the fluorescent lights clicked off one by one, she stayed behind in her office, reading each report again. Not because she doubted their contents, but because she needed to feel them line by line, decision by decision, the signatures of silence that allowed harm to repeat itself under the illusion of order. Each report was more than a record. It was a moment someone had cried out and no one answered. And the worst part was that she recognized the handwriting in some of the notes. She remembered the conversations in passing, the warnings spoken softly between tired colleagues, the way problems were sometimes reshaped to fit the limits of what the system was willing to acknowledge. Her phone buzzed once, lighting up the darkness on her desk. It was a text from a former academy instructor, someone she respected, someone who hadn't said a word publicly. "Tread lightly, Yvonne. You're not just walking into a storm, you're dragging the whole sky with you." She stared at it for a while, then powered the phone off, laying it face down next to the folder. When she left the building, the streets were almost empty, streetlights flickering to life with a mechanical click that echoed softly in the distance. She walked slowly to her car, listening to the sound of her own footsteps, steady and deliberate, echoing slightly off the pavement. The file was in her bag, but the weight of it was in her chest. Not just what it proved, but what it demanded. At home, Amira was asleep on the couch, curled under a soft blanket, her sketchpad resting against her chest. The television was on, but muted, flashing a news ticker about protests, statements, and public demands for reform. Yvonne stood in the doorway for a while, watching her daughter breathe small, even breaths that seemed lighter now, but still carried something fragile underneath. She sat down beside her, careful not to wake her, and gently moved the sketchpad to the side, her hand lingering for a moment on the drawing beneath it, a graphite image of two women standing side by side, one tall, one smaller, both facing a storm in the distance. She didn't cry. She didn't smile either. She just sat there, holding the moment like a photograph burned into the skin of her memory, because now she knew what had to come next. Not more meetings, not more promises, but exposure, accountability, consequence, and maybe, just maybe, change. She stood up slowly, her mind already composing the words she would deliver at the press conference the following morning. Her voice wouldn't shake, her message wouldn't bend, and when she stepped in front of that podium, she wouldn't be speaking just as a mother or a chief, but as a witness to a truth too long ignored. Somewhere deep in the house, a floorboard creaked, and outside the wind rattled the windows, as if the city itself had finally stirred in its sleep. The community center auditorium hadn't seen this many people in years. Rows of metal chairs filled to the edges, some pushed back against the walls, where late arrivals leaned, arms folded, brows furrowed, the kind of posture that said they hadn't come to listen but to measure. The air inside was heavy, not from heat, but from the density of voices held just behind closed mouths, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to speak first. At the front of the room, a wooden podium stood beneath a faded city seal, the microphone adjusted too high for anyone who wasn't used to standing there, and to its right sat a long table where panelists shifted in their seats, some scribbling on notepads, others scanning the crowd with expressions that ranged from concern to barely concealed defensiveness. Yvonne stood near the door for a moment before making her way down the side aisle, her boots clicking softly against the concrete floor, her presence turning heads even before she reached the front. She wasn't wearing her uniform tonight. She chose dark slacks, a black blouse, and a single gold pin at her collar. Not because she didn't want to be seen as Chief Brooks, but because she wanted to be heard as Yvonne, the mother, the citizen, the woman who had stood in a hallway and watched power turn into violence. She didn't sit with the panel. She didn't ask for a reserved seat. Instead, she took the last chair in the second row and waited like everyone else, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her gaze steady and unwavering. The moderator, a local pastor with kind eyes and a voice too gentle for the weight of the evening, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "We've gathered tonight," he began, "because what happened wasn't just a moment, it was a mirror. And for many of us, what we saw in that mirror, we didn't like." A low murmur swept through the crowd, some agreeing, some shifting uncomfortably, others watching, like they still weren't sure what side of the mirror they were on. "There will be time for open comments," he continued, "but first I'd like to invite Chief Brooks to say a few words." Yvonne stood without hesitation, every movement deliberate, not rehearsed but deeply rooted. She stepped toward the podium, adjusted the mic down an inch, and looked out at a sea of faces that held more emotion than words could capture. Parents holding children's hands too tightly, teachers with arms crossed over folders, elders nodding quietly from the back row, and teens leaning against walls with phones in hand already recording. "I wasn't going to speak tonight," she began, her voice clear but without ceremony. "Because there are times when words feel like a luxury, when action should speak louder. But then I realized if I stayed silent, I'd be part of the same system that taught silence is survival." She scanned the room slowly, not to command it, but to connect. "So let me say it plainly. My daughter was assaulted by someone wearing a badge inside a school in front of witnesses. And if she hadn't been my daughter, if I hadn't shown up when I did, she might have walked away, not just hurt but invisible." A woman near the front wiped at her eyes. A man, 3 rows back, let out a soft, sharp breath, the kind that's half grief, half rage. Yvonne continued, "But this isn't just about her. This is about every child who's learned that safety depends on being silent, still, and small. This is about every parent who's sat their kid down and said, 'Be careful, be polite, keep your hands visible,' not because they broke the law, but because the law breaks differently for some of us." She paused, letting that settle not as a blow but as an offering, a truth given without apology. "We've seen the footage. We've read the reports. But the real question is, what do we do now that we can't look away?" For a moment, no one moved. And then a voice spoke from the crowd, hesitant but firm. "What do you want from us?" It was a man in his 50s, blue windbreaker, hands clenched together in his lap. His question wasn't hostile. It was scared, as if he wanted to do something but didn't know what would matter. Yvonne turned toward him, nodded once. "I want you to stop pretending this is new," she said softly. "I want you to stop treating this like a scandal and start treating it like a symptom. I want you to demand more from the people you trust to protect your kids. And I want you to look in the mirror and ask why it took a viral video for you to care." The man nodded slowly, like someone finally hearing the echo of something he'd been trying to understand for years. Behind him another hand rose, then another, then another. Over the next hour, voices filled the room, some angry, some tired, some trembling, with a kind of quiet that had waited too long to be spoken. A teacher stood and described the fear in her students' eyes. A retired officer admitted he'd seen things he hadn't stopped and never forgave himself for. A teenager with a shaky voice told the room he didn't want to grow up, afraid of the people meant to protect him. And through it all, Yvonne listened, not as a leader collecting data, but as a woman absorbing the weight of every truth too long dismissed as emotion. When the final speaker sat down, the moderator returned to the front, his voice lower now. "Thank you, everyone. We'll share these transcripts with the district, and we'll push for change. But don't let tonight be the end of your voice. Let it be the beginning." The room slowly emptied, people lingering in clusters, still talking, still processing, still needing to know they weren't alone. Yvonne stepped outside into the crisp evening air, the sky above her, a soft canvas of indigo and gray streetlights, humming quietly against the dark. She took a long breath, slow and full, then let it out into the cool silence. And as she stood there on the steps, the last one to leave, her hands resting lightly on the rail, she realized something she hadn't felt in days. Not victory, not relief, but momentum, a shift in the current. a gathering of voices too powerful to be stilled. Not a wave yet, but the beginning of one. Inside the precinct, everything appeared to function, as usual. Phones rang, papers shuffled, radios cracked with coded dispatches, but under the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The energy was no longer one of rhythm and coordination, but of waiting like a hallway where a conversation had just ended badly, and everyone was pretending they hadn't heard it. Yvonne noticed it immediately, not in grand gestures or direct confrontation, but in the absence of what used to be there, the brief nods that carried mutual trust, the casual good mornings that once came with eye contact. Now the greetings were forced or skipped altogether, and every conversation stopped just half a second too early when she passed by. She moved through the building with calm efficiency, not because she didn't feel the tension but because she refused to let it shape her steps. Her office was on the second floor past the department's common room, where a group of officers stood, huddled around a coffee machine, their voices dipping as soon as she came into view. One of them, Daniels, a sergeant with 10 years under his belt and a reputation for being old school, didn't even try to pretend. He glanced at her, then leaned in closer to the others, whispering something that made two of them stifle a laugh. It was subtle, but not silent. And it was exactly the kind of rot she knew would surface once accountability was no longer abstract. In her office, the blinds were half open, letting sunlight streak across the desk in long slats, catching on dust motes and the rim of a cold coffee cup she hadn't touched since morning. She closed the door behind her with a quiet click, dropped her bag beside the chair, and sat down slowly, her eyes drifting toward the stack of reports waiting to be reviewed. But her mind wasn't on paperwork, it was on the silence outside her door, the kind that speaks louder than anger because it comes wrapped in cowardice. A soft knock interrupted the stillness. "Come in," she said already, knowing who it would be. Lieutenant Vega stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered but visibly uneasy, his mouth pulled into a tight line that looked rehearsed. "Chief," he began, pausing just long enough to reveal he wasn't sure how to continue. "I thought you should know there's been a lot of talk around the station. Some of the guys think things are changing too fast." Yvonne tilted her head slightly, waiting. "And what do you think?" she asked, her voice calm, not confrontational. Vega shifted on his feet, hands resting on his utility belt, a gesture she'd seen countless times from officers trying to ground themselves. "I think you're doing what needs to be done," he said honestly, "but not everyone's ready for it." She nodded once, then leaned forward, resting her forearms on the desk. "Readiness," she said quietly, "is a luxury we don't have when people's rights are being trampled under our own roof." Her eyes held his for a beat too long, just long enough to let the weight of the moment settle. "Tell them," she added, "change isn't waiting on comfort." Vega nodded slowly. "I'll pass it along," he said, though the hesitation in his step as he turned suggested he wasn't sure how it would be received. As the door clicked shut behind him, Yvonne sat back and exhaled the kind of breath that feels like releasing something you've been holding just under the skin. She wasn't angry, not yet. What she felt was harder to name, something like exhaustion braided with clarity, the kind of clarity that comes from knowing the truth and carrying it into rooms that weren't built to hear it. Later that afternoon, as she passed through the bullpen, she overheard the end of a sentence that wasn't meant for her. "If it wasn't her kid, none of this would even matter," someone muttered the words, tossed carelessly into the air like a spark into dry grass. Yvonne stopped, mid-step, turned toward the sound and let the silence do the work. Officers froze the air, stiffening, as if the building itself had braced for impact. She walked forward slowly, eyes landing on Daniels, who looked up with that same defiant tilt in his jaw. "Was that you?" she asked, her voice low even. He didn't deny it. "I said what I said," he replied, tone cool but clipped. "You're turning this department into a circus because you got personal." There it was, the real accusation, unvarnished and rooted in fear. Not fear of her daughter's pain, not fear of misconduct, but fear of losing the illusion of control. Yvonne stepped closer, closing the space between them, until the room itself seemed to narrow. "You think this is about me?" she asked, not shouting, not flinching. "Then you haven't been listening. And maybe that's the real problem." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Around them, no one moved, no one defended him, and that silence finally felt like progress. That evening, after the building had emptied and the overhead lights dimmed to their night-mode glow, Yvonne sat alone in the briefing room, reviewing training footage from the academy. On screen, a younger Brenton barked commands during a simulation, his tone aggressive, his posture exaggerated, his eyes cold. She paused the video, staring at the frozen frame, his hand on a trainee's chest, pushing him back, shouting something blurred by static. She rewound it, watched again, then turned off the monitor and sat in the dark for a long while, her fingers resting lightly on the table's edge. There would be more like him, she knew. Officers who believed authority meant dominance, who interpreted procedure as power, who masked bias behind policy. But she also knew that the tide didn't change all at once. It turned slowly, pulled by hands willing to reach into the water again and again, even when it stung. Outside the parking lot was nearly empty, the streetlights flickering in and out of rhythm, casting shadows that stretched across the pavement like quiet questions waiting for answers. She stepped out into the cool air, wrapped her coat a little tighter, and let the night settle around her. The building behind her hummed with electricity, but in her chest the stillness returned, not weakness, not retreat, but the kind of quiet that comes before resolve. She knew tomorrow would bring more resistance, more whispers, more calculated indifference, but it would also bring more reason to keep going. And as she reached her car and looked once more at the precinct doors, she felt no fear, just clarity, and the unshakable decision to walk back through them again come morning. The courthouse was full before the doors officially opened, every bench, occupied every aisle, flanked by those willing to stand for hours just to bear witness. The room pulsed with a strange energy, the kind that comes when justice is promised but not yet delivered, when truth hangs in the air like a breath waiting to be exhaled. The walls were old, paneled in dark wood, the kind that carried the echoes of other trials, other verdicts, some fair, many not. In the quiet moments before the judge entered, people spoke in whispers, not out of respect, but because they were afraid to say aloud what they feared most, that even now, even after everything, it still might not matter. Yvonne sat in the front row, her shoulders square, her hands folded neatly in her lap, every line of her posture a reflection of control. But her fingers pressed against each other more tightly than she realized, and her breath, though steady, caught each time the courtroom door creaked open behind her. Amira sat beside her, dressed in a navy blue sweater and black pants, her hair pulled back tightly, her face composed but pale. She didn't speak, didn't fidget, just stared straight ahead at the empty witness stand with a gaze far older than her 12 years should allow. Yvonne glanced down once, watching her daughter's foot sway slightly above the floor, not quite reaching, and then looked away, unwilling to let her own emotions unspool in front of the cameras. Across the room, Chad Brenton sat at the defense table, his jaw clenched, a deep line etched between his brows, as if scowling could still bend the facts. He wore a dark suit that didn't quite fit him right, like someone trying to hide behind the idea of civility, hoping that fabric could erase memory. His attorney leaned in every few minutes, whispering with a hand covering his mouth, but Brenton barely acknowledged him. His eyes flickered often toward Yvonne, sometimes toward Amira, but mostly toward the judge's bench where all outcomes lived and died. The judge entered quietly, a woman in her 60s with salt-gray hair pulled back into a low bun and a gaze that gave nothing away. When she spoke, her voice was low, clear, and calm, the voice of someone who had seen too many lives altered in too few words. "We're here to deliver a verdict in the matter of Officer Chad Brenton," she said, without ceremony or pause. After reviewing the evidence, the testimonies, and the conduct in question, the court finds the defendant guilty of misconduct, abuse of authority, and unlawful use of force. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed like stones into still water, heavy, inevitable, and final. A wave of reactions rippled quietly through the courtroom. Some gasped, some nodded slowly, some closed their eyes, as if allowing themselves finally to breathe. Yvonne didn't react right away. She sat still, every muscle locked in place, waiting to be sure the ground beneath her wasn't shifting again. Then Amira's hand slid gently into hers, fingers, cool but firm, and Yvonne turned to her daughter, seeing something in her eyes that hadn't been there since the day it happened, a small light. Not joy, not triumph, but safety. Brenton exhaled hard, like a man who had been holding on to the illusion of invincibility until the very last second. His shoulders slumped, his mouth opened slightly, and for the first time in weeks, he looked like someone who understood what he'd lost. He didn't look at Yvonne again. He didn't dare. The judge continued outlining the next steps, the sentencing date, the procedural closing remarks, but Yvonne didn't hear most of it. Her focus was on Amira, who hadn't let go of her hand, who was now blinking rapidly but refusing to let a single tear fall. Yvonne leaned in slightly and whispered, "You were brave." Amira nodded, her voice small. "It's over now, right?" Yvonne hesitated, because she knew that what had happened wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning of something else, something heavier. The paperwork, the reviews, the fallout in the department, the media, the tension still lingering in precinct corridors like cigarette smoke. But none of that was her daughter's burden. "For you it is," she said quietly. "For me not yet." Outside the courthouse, the sun had begun to lower, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, where press cameras waited and microphones blinked with red lights. Protest signs leaned against walls, some still held by tired hands, others placed carefully where they could be seen, but no longer shouted. People gathered in clusters, some embracing, some crying, others standing alone in silence, their faces turned toward the heavy wooden doors, like they were waiting for something to come out and change their lives. Yvonne guided Amira down the steps, slowly, one hand on her daughter's back, the other shielding her from flashes and shouts. "Chief Brooks, do you have a statement?" someone called out. "How does it feel to see a guilty verdict?" another asked. But Yvonne didn't stop. She didn't speak. She didn't look at them, not out of anger, out of choice, because this moment wasn't for them. It was for the girl beside her who had stood tall on the witness stand, who had described what it felt like to be shoved, to be struck, to be seen not as a child but as a threat, and who had told the truth even when her voice shook. They walked past the crowd, past the line of police vehicles and black sedans, past the people with microphones and notepads, and reached their car parked just around the corner. Inside, the air was still quiet, thick with the scent of seat leather warmed by the afternoon sun. Amira climbed in first, dropping her backpack at her feet, then leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. Yvonne took her seat behind the wheel, both hands resting on the steering wheel for a moment before turning the key. The engine hummed to life, but she didn't drive away yet. Instead, she looked over at her daughter, studying the soft curve of her brow, the way her eyelashes trembled slightly, even in sleep. And for a long moment she allowed herself to feel the weight of it, not just the verdict, not just the headlines, but the cost. Then she reached over and gently adjusted the air vent, turning it toward Amira, making sure the breeze hit her just right. She looked up into the rearview mirror, saw her own face reflected back, tired, steady, changed, and let the image settle there quiet and true. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just nodded once to no one in particular, as if to say, "We're still here." And then she drove home. The house was quieter than usual that evening, not because no one was speaking, but because the silence had a purpose. Now it was a kind of stillness that followed resolution, the heavy quiet that only comes when something long held finally releases its grip. The sun outside had dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the living room floor, the amber light catching on the framed photos that lined the bookshelf, pictures of school events, vacations, birthdays, and that one from Amira's fifth-grade play where she stood in a cardboard crown smiling like the world would never hurt her. Yvonne sat at the kitchen table, one hand wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold, the other resting gently against a page of her daughter's sketchbook left open beside her. The drawing was simple but precise, two hands reaching across a gap, one smaller than the other, their fingers almost touching. The lines were soft, hesitant in places, but the meaning was unmistakable. She traced the outline of the hands with her eyes, her throat tightening, as she thought about everything those fingers had endured in silence before finding the strength to speak in court. From the other room came the soft click of a television remote, followed by Amira's footsteps, light but steady, as she made her way down the hall and into the kitchen. She paused in the doorway, leaning slightly against the frame, her arms crossed, not defensively, just in that way she did when she wasn't sure what to say yet. Her hair was still damp from the shower, and she wore the oversized hoodie that Yvonne had bought her at the museum last fall, the sleeves too long but comforting in that way only favorite clothes can be. "Hey," Amira said quietly. Yvonne looked up and offered a small smile. "Hey, baby. You hungry?" Amira shrugged. "Not really. Just tired, I guess." She walked over and pulled out the chair opposite her mother, sitting down slowly, her gaze falling to the sketchbook between them. "I started that after the hearing," she said softly. "Before we knew what the judge would say." Yvonne nodded, taking in the subtle tension still etched around her daughter's eyes. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's strong." Amira traced one of the pencil lines with her fingertip and whispered, "I was scared it wouldn't be enough." Yvonne reached across the table, her hand resting gently on Amira's. "You were more than enough," she said. "You stood in front of a courtroom full of strangers and told the truth. That takes more courage than most people find in a lifetime. Amira didn't speak, but she didn't look away either. Her eyes stayed on her mother's face, searching for the cracks that might give away fear or anger or regret. But Yvonne's expression held steady, not hardened, not heroic, just steady, like she had finally found a piece of ground that wouldn't shift beneath her. They sat like that for a while, the silence between them not empty but full of things that had already been said, things that no longer needed to be spoken aloud. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, sending a gentle tapping against the window pane, and from somewhere deeper in the house, the heater kicked on with a soft hum, wrapping the space in a warmth that felt earned. Amira finally pulled her hand back and stood stretching her arms over her head with a small groan. "I think I'll go to bed early," she said. "Tomorrow's still school, right?" Yvonne smiled, a quiet laugh catching in her chest. "Yeah," she said, "life keeps going." She watched her daughter move toward the hallway, pausing at the entrance, turning back with a question in her eyes that she didn't voice, but Yvonne answered it anyway. "You did good, Amira, and I'm proud of you." Amira nodded, once her mouth twitching into a smile too soft to hold, and then disappeared down the hall, her door closing with the faintest click behind her. Yvonne exhaled slowly, then reached for the sketchbook again, closing it carefully and setting it aside. The tea was cold, but she drank it anyway, the bitterness grounding her in a way she didn't entirely resent. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she let it ring. There would be messages from reporters, from colleagues, from people who had stayed silent until the verdict was read, and now wanted to stand beside her. But tonight wasn't for any of them. She walked to the window and stood there for a moment, watching, as the streetlights blinked on one by one, their glow washing over the sidewalk where Amira used to draw with chalk in the summers, leaving hearts and stars and the occasional misspelled poem. It felt like a lifetime ago, but even now those faint traces still showed up sometimes when it rained, little ghosts of color rising from the concrete, as if they had never fully washed away. The neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked in the distance. A car passed slowly down the block, its headlights sweeping across the houses before disappearing again. And in that stillness, Yvonne allowed herself to breathe not just the deep mechanical breath she'd practiced in the mirror before meetings, but something softer, something real. She closed her eyes, resting her forehead lightly against the glass, and let the quiet settle over her shoulders like a shawl. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't waiting for the next fight. For the first time in weeks, no one was watching her to see if she would break. She wasn't Chief Brooks in this moment. She wasn't a headline or a statement or a point of contention. She was just a mother standing in her home, listening to the echo of her daughter's steps fading down the hallway. And in that moment, everything felt still. Not resolved, not healed, but still. And that for now was enough. The precinct walls hadn't changed, but the way people walked through them had more watchful now, more deliberate, like every step was carrying not just their weight, but the weight of what they stood for. Yvonne felt it in the quiet corners of the building, in the shift of conversations, when she entered a room in the way. Even the most seasoned officers now took longer pauses before speaking, as if measuring their words not out of fear but out of awakening. What had started as a scandal was now something larger, uncomfortable, unrelenting but necessary. And she knew the discomfort wasn't just theirs. It lived in her too, like a second heartbeat, reminding her that leadership wasn't about being obeyed, it was about being watched, tested, doubted, and still showing up with her spine straight and her purpose louder than their whispers. The reforms didn't roll out with fanfare or applause. They arrived in memos, meetings, and the kind of language that looked neutral on paper but carried resistance between the lines. She introduced new guidelines for school officers, requiring regular evaluations, de-escalation training, and full transparency around student interactions. Every policy was backed by precedent, but none passed without friction. Daniels was the first to speak out in the staff meeting, arms crossed and voice tinged with skepticism. "So now we're just supposed to bend every time public opinion shifts?" he asked, not accusatory, but tight with resentment. Yvonne didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her voice calm but sharp. "We don't bend for opinion," she said. "We bend for truth. And sometimes we break for justice." Some officers nodded. Others did not. But no one interrupted her again. Outside the department, the reaction was louder. Media outlets ran segments not just on the verdict, but on the reforms, analyzing every change like it was a threat or a promise. Community groups reached out with cautious support, and parents showed up to board meetings in numbers that surprised even the most jaded administrators. There were posters, panels, online petitions, but also questions, tough ones. Some asked why it took personal tragedy for change to begin. Others wondered if it would last once the headlines faded. Yvonne welcomed every question, because they meant people were paying attention. She knew public focus was a fragile thing prone to drifting toward the next crisis, the next outrage. But for now they were watching, and that was enough to keep going. At home, Amira was slowly returning to herself, though not the exact self from before. She laughed more easily now, but there was something wiser behind her smile, something sharper in her eyes. One afternoon, as Yvonne was reviewing updated department compliance logs at the kitchen table, Amira walked in holding a flyer from school. "They're doing a justice assembly," she said, placing the paper in front of her mother. "They asked if I want to say something." Yvonne looked at her gently, setting down her pen. "And do you?" Amira hesitated, biting her lower lip the way she did when she was thinking through something bigger than herself. "I'm scared," she admitted. "But I think I want to. I think, if I say it, maybe other kids won't feel so alone." Yvonne's throat tightened. She reached across the table and took her daughter's hand, giving it a soft squeeze. "Then say it, baby. Say it loud enough that even the ones trying not to hear it feel it anyway." The following week, Yvonne was invited to speak at a community town hall, not because she was a chief, but because she was a catalyst. The room was filled with folding chairs and people who had never attended a police event before. Teachers, artists, janitors, grandmothers, teenagers. Some clapped when she entered. Some sat with arms folded. All of them listened. She didn't bring a speech. She brought her truth. She spoke about Amira, about silence, about how systems don't rot all at once, they erode slowly when good people stay quiet too long. Afterward, a woman in her 70s approached her with tears in her eyes and said, "I thought I wouldn't live long enough to hear someone in your position say what we've all been thinking." Yvonne smiled, not for the compliment, but for the echo. It created the feeling that words, when rooted in truth, can travel farther than anyone expects. Back at the precinct, not all were convinced. Some officers transferred. Some stayed but kept their distance. But others, quietly, one by one, began to ask better questions. They asked about bias training, about youth outreach, about whether policy could actually prevent harm or just respond to it. And when they asked, Yvonne listened. She didn't lead with perfection. She led with presence. She made space for doubt without ceding ground to denial. One morning, Officer Mercer, who had never been hostile but always distant, knocked on her door with a manila folder and a different look in his eyes. "I've been working on a draft for the new mentorship program," he said, placing it on her desk. "Might be worth a look." Yvonne opened it, skimming the first few lines, her lips curving into something subtle and real. "Looks like progress," she said. Mercer nodded once. "Still a long way to go." "Yes," she replied. "But it's a start." That night after dinner, Amira sat at the kitchen table sketching again. This time, a group of students under a tree holding signs, their faces different but their stances unified. Yvonne watched from the doorway, arms crossed loosely over her chest, the corners of her mouth soft, with something close to peace. "Are you going to share that one too?" she asked. Amira glanced up. "Maybe," she said. "Depends who needs to see it." And with that, Yvonne turned off the hallway light, letting the warm kitchen glow spill gently across her daughter's shoulders. She didn't need to say anything else. Because some legacies aren't built in policy or headlines or podiums. Some are passed in quiet moments, between pencil strokes, between breaths, between people who decide to tell the truth and keep telling it even when their voices shake. And in that moment, standing in her home, watching her daughter draw strength in the form of lines and shadows, Yvonne understood something, not just with her mind, but with her whole being. Justice doesn't always arrive with a gavel. Sometimes it begins with a sketchbook. The press conference wasn't held in a marble government building or a stately courtroom. It took place under a white canopy tent in a city park where the ground was still damp from last night's rain and the folding chairs had to be wiped down before anyone dared sit. The podium was simple, no frills, just a wooden stand with a modest seal on the front and a single microphone clipped at the top. Around it gathered a crowd of reporters, activists, local parents, and a few curious onlookers, some with arms crossed tightly against their chests, others with phones raised already recording before the first word had been spoken. A low breeze stirred the air, rustling the paper programs in people's hands and tugging at the corner of the banner that read "Community Safety, Accountability, and Trust, a New Beginning." Yvonne stood just behind the podium, not in uniform, but in a tailored navy blazer and dark slacks, her presence composed and resolute. She had declined to have anyone introduce her. This was her moment, and her words would carry more weight without preamble or filter. As she stepped forward, the crowd quieted the ambient noise of the city, still humming faintly in the background, the distant honk of a car, the muffled bark of a dog, the steady buzz of camera shutters clicking to life. "I'm not here to make a speech," she began, her voice strong but not loud, steady in its intention. "I'm here to make a promise, and not just as your chief of police, but as a mother, a neighbor, and a woman who has seen firsthand what silence costs." She scanned the faces in front of her, taking in the varied expressions, some skeptical, some hopeful, many somewhere in between. "We talk about justice like it's an event, something that happens after the damage is done. But real justice isn't reactive. It's proactive, it's uncomfortable, and it demands more than policy. It demands a shift in who we believe deserves protection." The applause came slowly, at first polite and measured, until a few claps turned into a ripple of agreement that spread across the lawn. Yvonne waited until it faded, then continued. "In the weeks since the incident involving my daughter, we've heard a lot about accountability. But accountability without transformation is just punishment. So today we're announcing a new initiative, one that puts community voices at the center of safety." She outlined the reforms in clear, unflinching detail: independent oversight for school resource officers, real-time complaint reporting systems, mandatory public forums on policing practices, and most notably the creation of a youth justice advisory board led by students themselves. Each measure was designed not just to respond to past harm, but to prevent future harm, and to make sure no child felt powerless inside a school building again. "We don't need to raise our children to survive the system," she said. "We need to raise the system to deserve our children." The crowd was silent then, not out of disapproval, but because the weight of that sentence needed time to settle. A young mother near the front wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her hoodie. A teenage boy in a red beanie lowered his phone and simply nodded to himself. These weren't political gestures, they were human ones. After the conference ended, people approached Yvonne in small groups, some to thank her, others to question her, a few just to stand beside her for a moment without speaking. She welcomed them all. She answered each question calmly, without deflection. She didn't promise perfection. She promised presence. And in a world that had so often equated leadership with distance, that was more radical than any slogan could capture. Later that evening, back at home, the house was filled with the smells of garlic and roasted vegetables. Amira's request for a celebratory dinner that neither of them really had the energy to cook, but had committed to anyway. Yvonne moved around the kitchen with deliberate ease, sliding a tray into the oven, setting two mismatched plates on the table, and humming under her breath, a tune she didn't realize she still remembered. Amira sat at the counter, sketchbook open, but she wasn't drawing. She was just sitting, watching her mother with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think it'll work?" she asked finally, her voice soft but not uncertain. Yvonne turned, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and leaned back against the counter. "What do you mean?" "The reforms, the new board, the stuff you said at the park. Do you think it'll change anything?" Yvonne considered the question carefully, not because she didn't know her answer, but because Amira deserved the full weight of truth. "It'll change some things," she said. "It won't fix everything. It won't erase what happened. But it gives people tools. It gives them a voice. And sometimes that's how the cracks start." Amira nodded slowly, then closed the sketchbook and placed it on the table. "I want to go to one of the forums," she said. "Not to speak. Just to listen." Yvonne smiled, her eyes warming with quiet pride. "Then I'll save you a seat." They ate dinner in companionable silence, interrupted only by the occasional clink of a fork or the pop of the oven cooling down. It wasn't a grand celebration. It didn't need to be. It was enough to share a meal in peace, without fear, without pretending. Afterward, as the night stretched out and the world quieted again, Yvonne stepped outside onto the porch with a cup of tea in hand. The sky above was clear, dotted with stars, the air cool enough to raise goosebumps on her arms. She stood there for a long moment, listening, not for danger, not for applause, but for the sound of her neighborhood breathing. A window opened 2 houses down. Someone laughed faintly from a back patio. Somewhere a wind chime danced in the breeze. And in that small chorus of everyday sounds, she found the answer to Amira's question, not in certainty but in motion. Change was happening. It was quiet. It was slow, but it was real. And this time it had a face. On the final day of the school year, the air carried that distinct hum of closing chapters, half excitement, half exhaustion, and something quieter underneath that only the adults really understood. Parents filtered through the front gates with soft smiles and gift bags. Teachers waved from classroom doors with practice cheer, and kids ran ahead of one another in bursts of freedom, shoes, scuffing tile, and laughter bouncing off the walls like sunlight. But through all of it, Yvonne stood still in the hallway near the main office, her hands tucked into the pockets of her blazer, watching the current of movement without stepping into it. This wasn't just another afternoon for her, and it wasn't just the end of a school year. It was the first time she'd set foot in this building since the day everything unraveled. The walls had been painted since then. A fresh coat of soft blue now covered the institutional beige that once lined the corridors. Security cameras had been upgraded, and a new school resource officer stood near the front entrance, a young black woman with a calm stance and a sharp eye. Someone Yvonne had personally recommended for the post. It wasn't just symbolic, it was structural. Change slow, as it was had roots now. And yet even with all that progress, stepping through the doors had pressed against something in her chest she hadn't known was still tender. Amira emerged from the art room a few moments later, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her sketchpad hugged tightly against her chest, like a secret she wasn't quite ready to share. She was taller now, just a little, and her hair was longer, tied back in a neat braid that swung behind her as she walked. When she spotted her mother, her face lit up in that quiet, internal way she'd inherited, the kind of smile that didn't need a wide grin to be true. "You came," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I said I would," Yvonne replied, meeting her halfway down the hall. "Wouldn't miss this for anything." They didn't embrace, not here, not in front of students and teachers, and that subtle undercurrent of watchful eyes. But Amira's shoulder brushed lightly against her mother's arm as they walked side by side toward the exit, a gesture so natural it felt sacred. Outside, the sunlight was warm without being overbearing, and the trees lining the school's driveway swayed in slow rhythm, casting shadows that rippled gently over the sidewalk. A few reporters lingered near the parking lot, clearly hoping for a comment, but Yvonne didn't even glance in their direction. She had made enough statements in press rooms, courtrooms, and public hearings to last a lifetime. This wasn't about sound bites anymore. This was about walking her daughter home. "How did the portfolio review go?" she asked as they reached the car. Amira slid into the passenger seat, buckled her belt, and gave a nonchalant shrug, but there was a brightness in her voice when she replied. "Miss Chen said, I'm getting better at perspective. I'm not so scared of drawing hands anymore." Yvonne smiled, easing the car onto the road. "Hands are tough. Takes practice to get them right." Amira looked out the window for a beat, then said, "Yeah, but when you finally get it, when the fingers actually look like they belong, it's kind of magic." Yvonne glanced sideways, catching the way the girl's fingers were now tracing invisible lines on the window's edge, sketching in the air as if the world itself were her canvas. They drove in companionable silence for a while, the city passing around them like scenery in a play that no longer needed to shout. When they stopped at a red light near the library, Amira turned suddenly, her voice quieter now. "Do you think he ever really understood what he did?" Yvonne didn't ask who she meant. There was only one he in the shadow of their shared story. She tapped her thumb lightly against the steering wheel, then said, "I think he understood that the world wasn't going to let him pretend it didn't happen. Whether or not he felt it, that's harder to know." Amira nodded, her gaze returning to the window, and Yvonne didn't push the conversation further. Some truths are not meant to be unpacked all at once. They unfold slowly over time, like drawings revealed in careful layers of shading and light. At home, the smell of jasmine drifted in through the open windows, carried on the early summer breeze, and the air was filled with the subtle clinking of wind chimes and the distant laughter of neighborhood kids chasing each other across the lawns. Yvonne stepped into the kitchen, poured 2 glasses of lemonade, and set them on the table just as Amira came in and dropped her backpack by the door with a gentle thud. The girl opened her sketchbook and flipped through the pages, pausing at one near the middle. "Can I show you something?" she asked. Yvonne sat down beside her, and Amira turned the book around, revealing a drawing in soft pencil lines, 2 figures back to back, one in a blazer, the other in a hoodie, their outlines distinct but connected by a shared shadow that stretched between them like a thread. Above them, a single word had been written in delicate script: witness. Yvonne stared at it for a long moment, her throat tightening, not with sorrow, but with something deeper: recognition. She reached out, brushing a finger lightly over the page. "You saw all of it?" she said, her voice hushed. "And you remembered?" "I didn't want to forget," Amira replied. "Even the hard parts." They sat there as the light faded slowly, letting the weight of that page hold them together in a silence that felt whole. And as the first stars began to appear above their quiet street, Yvonne looked at her daughter, not just as the child she had sworn to protect, but as the young artist, the witness, the truth-teller, who had walked through fire and drawn her way out the other side. In that moment, she didn't think about the hearings, the reforms, the statements, or the meetings that still awaited her. She didn't think about the officers who still whispered, or the journalists who still called, or the questions that would never fully be answered. She simply thought, she's okay. And for the first time in a long time, that thought was enough. When a mother saw her daughter being treated unfairly, she didn't choose silence. She didn't choose to fight back with anger. Instead, she stood firm with truth, with courage, and with love. This story isn't just about laws or justice. It's a reminder that sometimes the strongest thing we can do is stand up and say, I see. I will not look away. Life isn't always fair, especially for those who've been silent for too long. But every act of courage, whether it's speaking a truth, drawing a picture, or simply listening to someone in pain, can change an entire community. Whether you're a grandparent, a parent, or simply a witness, never underestimate the power of presence, of compassion, and of speaking up when no one else dares to. Because justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins in the heart. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that justice starts with the little things, with courage and truth, please like this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue following powerful, thoughtful, and deeply human stories like this one. Every subscription isn't just support, it's a way to help share voices of truth, kindness, and hope for a more just world. Thank you for listening.